1799, Virginia. A baby boy named Dred Scott was born into slavery. Very little is known about the early years of Scott's existence. His family life and early childhood as a slave is shrouded in mystery. But what is known is that as he grew into adulthood, he eventually became the property of Peter Blow. In 1818, Scott moved with his slave owner to Alabama, where Peter tried his hand at farming. When that failed, Peter moved to Missouri in 1830, where he ran a boarding house and hotel. Both Alabama and Missouri were slave states. 2 years later, in 1832, the Blow family decided Scott was no longer needed. So they sold Scott to an army surgeon named Dr. John Emerson. Dr. Emerson took Scott to Fort Armstrong, located in Illinois. Illinois was a free state since slavery had been outlawed under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in regions between the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and the Great Lakes. Scott lived in Illinois for approximately 2.5 years. In 1836, Dr. Emerson and Scott moved to Fort Snelling in the Wisconsin Territory. The Wisconsin Territory also prohibited slavery and was declared free after 1820 due to a U.S. congressional agreement known as the Missouri Compromise. There he met another slave, Harriet. They fell in love and eventually married in a slave wedding. The wedding between two slaves was most unusual because an actual civil ceremony took place. After the wedding, ownership of Harriet was transferred to Dr. Emerson. Scott's extended stay in Illinois and Wisconsin, a free state and territory respectively, gave him legal standing to make a claim for freedom. But Scott never did so. No one knows exactly why Scott never sought his freedom. Perhaps he was unaware of his rights under the law, or maybe he was content with his life with Dr. Emerson. Later, in 1837, Dr. Emerson was transferred to Louisiana, a slave state. But Scott and Harriet didn't accompany Dr. Emerson. Instead, they stayed in Wisconsin and were hired out as slaves. By hiring Scott out in Wisconsin, Dr. Emerson was effectively bringing the institution of slavery into a free territory, which was a direct violation of the Missouri Compromise. In 1838, Dr. Emerson married Eliza Irene Sanford. He summoned both Scott and Harriet to join him and his new wife in Louisiana. The couple left the free territory of Wisconsin by themselves and traveled alone down the Mississippi River. They had ample opportunity to escape slavery by running away, but they did not. Instead, they voluntarily re-entered the slave state of Louisiana and met their master. That same year, Dr. Emerson and Irene left Louisiana and moved back with Scott and Harriet to the free territory of Wisconsin. Two years later, in 1840, Dr. Emerson moved his wife Irene and his slaves back to the slave state of Missouri. In 1843, Dr. Emerson died, leaving his wife Irene as Scott's new slave owner. Only after Emerson's death did Scott finally seek freedom for himself and his wife. At first, he offered to buy his freedom from Irene for $300, but she refused. Then, in 1846, Scott sought his freedom through the courts. Missouri state law said when a slave is taken to a free territory, they automatically become free and cannot be re-enslaved upon returning to a slave state. This was known as the once free, always free doctrine. Unfortunately, Scott and Harriet filed their lawsuit for freedom at a time when pro-slavery judges sat on Missouri's Supreme Court. These justices decided not to follow Missouri's long-standing, once free, always free doctrine, and ruled both were still slaves. Demoralized but undeterred, Scott took his fight to the highest court in the land. With the help of anti-slavery lawyers, Dred Scott appealed his fight for freedom to the United States Supreme Court, arguing his residence in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin released him from the bonds of slavery. Was Dred Scott a free man, or still a slave? Writing the majority opinion for the United States Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled Scott was not a free man and still a slave. First, Scott was never a free man even though he lived in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin. The laws which declared these places free were unlawfully depriving slave owners of their rightful property. At the time, slaves were considered property. Freeing a slave was the equivalent of the government unconstitutionally taking away a slave owner's property without due process of law. This was forbidden under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which states, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Second, Chief Justice Taney said since Scott was a slave, he could never be considered a citizen of the United States, and therefore was not even allowed to bring his case for freedom before any court. Taney said the Founding Fathers and the drafters of the Declaration of Independence meant to create a perpetual and impassable barrier between the white race and the one which they had reduced to slavery. Consequently, slaves were not and never intended to be included in the definition of citizen under the U.S. Constitution. On the contrary, slaves were a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race and, whether emancipated or not, remained subject to their authority. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling, Dred Scott and his wife Harriet did, in fact, eventually get their freedom, but not through the courts. 3 months after the Supreme Court's decision, Scott and Harriet were sold by their slave owner Irene back to the Blow family, the very same family who originally owned Scott and sold him to Dr. Emerson. Both Scott and Harriet were freed in 1857. By denying Scott his freedom, the U.S. Supreme Court made one of its most controversial decisions ever. While the South was jubilant, the North was outraged. Northerners immediately denounced the decision as wicked and cowardly. They protested the pro-Southern bias of the decision. It allowed, virtually unchecked, the spread of slavery into free territories and states, threatening the economic livelihood of free white workers whose jobs would be jeopardized by slavery. Chief Justice Taney intended the court's decision to end the slavery controversy once and for all. But instead, it inflamed the passions of both the South and North and accelerated a chain of events that eventually led to the secession of the South from the Union, and, ultimately, catapulted the nation into civil war.
Thanks for watching. Click subscribe so you don't miss our next video. More riddles, puzzles, and brain teasers are on the way. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.